Nobody touches her." His voice cut through that church like a blade. Every head turned. Every breath stopped. The auctioneer froze mid-sentence with his gavel in the air and his mouth still open. Colt Mercer hadn't spoken to another human being in 4 months, hadn't stood in a room full of people in 3 years, hadn't touched a woman in 10. But he walked straight up that aisle, took Eleanor Vale's face in both hands, and kissed her right there in front of God and Harold Whitmore and every soul in Caldwell Creek. Then he threw gold coins at the preacher's feet and said, "She's mine. We're done here." If you're new here, subscribe, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The bidding had already started. Harold Whitmore stood at the front of the church with the posture of a man who had already won, because in his mind, he had. He'd been patient. He'd waited through the grief, waited through the funeral, waited through the long quiet. The funeral waited through the long quiet weeks, while Eleanor Vale sat alone in that house, trying to figure out what came next. And when the debts came due, her father's debts, every last one of them, Harold had been right there. Smiling, helpful, devastating. "$50, called a voice from the third pew. A rancher named Briggs, red-faced and grinning like he was at a livestock auction. Because that's exactly what this was. Eleanor didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead at the cross above the altar and breathed through her nose the way her mother had taught her to do when things got unbearable. One breath, then another. Her hands were folded, her chin was level, and if anyone in that room thought she was about to cry, they were wrong. She was past crying. She had cried for 3 weeks straight after her father died. She had no tears left. What she had now was something colder, something harder. The particular kind of stillness that settles into a person when they've run out of options and decided that dignity is the only thing left worth protecting. "$60, said another voice, closer. She didn't turn to look. Reverend Aldous stood beside her, his Bible clutched in both hands, his face carrying the expression of a man trying very hard to believe he wasn't complicit in something shameful. He'd told himself this was legal. He'd told himself Eleanor had agreed. He had not asked himself what choice she'd actually had. The church was full. That surprised her still even now. She hadn't expected people to come and watch. But they had. Half the town of Caldwell Creek, Montana packed into the pews on a Tuesday afternoon to witness Eleanor Vale get sold off to cover a dead man's gambling debts. Some of them she'd known her whole life. Old Mrs. Hatch, who'd taught her to read. The Bremer brothers, who used to race horses with her father on Sunday afternoons. They all sat there, watching. And not one of them had stood up. "$75, said Harold Whitmore, and his voice landed on her like a stone dropped into still water. Low, deliberate. He wasn't bidding because he needed to win. He was bidding to remind everyone in the room that he already had. The doors exploded open, not swung, not pushed, exploded with a force that sent both panels crashing against the inside walls and snapped every head in the church toward the back like a single creature with one startled neck. The sound was a thunderclap in that quiet room, and in the half-second of silence that followed it, Eleanor heard her own heartbeat. Then she saw him. He was enormous. Not just tall, wide through the shoulders, in a way that suggested he'd spent years hauling something heavy, and the kind of lean that came not from hunger, but from hard use. His coat was worn through at the elbows. His beard was 3 months past needing a trim. He had eyes the color of creek water in winter, pale and clear and absolutely devoid of confusion. He knew exactly where he was. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he was walking toward her. The crowd had gone silent with that particular quality of silence that only happens when something truly unexpected enters a room. Not the polite quiet of attention, but the stunned quiet of people who have momentarily forgotten how to react. Briggs had his mouth open. Old Reverend Aldous had taken 2 steps back without appearing to notice. Harold Whitmore had gone very still, the way a man goes still when he realizes the situation has just slipped outside his control. The stranger didn't look at any of them. He walked straight up the center aisle, his boots striking the floorboards in a rhythm that didn't rush and didn't hesitate. And when he reached the altar, he didn't slow down. He stepped up beside Eleanor, and she got 1/2 second to see his face up close. The hard jaw, the old scar along his cheekbone, the way his eyes found hers with an intensity that felt almost like recognition. And then his hands came up and cupped her face, and he kissed her. Not a gentle kiss. Not a performance. A real one. The kind that has weight behind it. The kind that is clearly about something, even if you can't name what. His hands were rough and warm against her jaw, and he kissed her like a man planting a flag. Like a man staking a claim. Eleanor Vale had not been kissed in 4 years. She stood absolutely frozen for 3 full seconds. And then, against every rational instinct she possessed, she kissed him back. He pulled away first, looked at her for one strange, suspended moment. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a pouch that clinked heavy when he moved, and threw it at the feet of Reverend Aldous. Gold coins scattered across the floorboards, like dropped marbles rolling under pews, spinning against boots. "That covers the debt," the man said. His voice was low and rough, the voice of someone who didn't speak often and had stopped apologizing for it. Every cent. And then some. The silence in the church was absolute. Then Harold Whitmore said very quietly, "This is not how this works." The stranger turned to look at him for the first time. Just looked. Didn't speak. Didn't move. Just held Whitmore's gaze with the particular patience of a man who had dealt with things considerably more dangerous than a banker in a wool suit, and was willing to wait as long as it took for that fact to become clear. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "I don't know who you are." "Colt Mercer." Still quiet, still unhurried. "And you do know who I am, Harold. You knew my father." Something moved across Whitmore's face. Something complicated and fast, like a shadow passing over water. And for just a moment, just one, the banker's certainty flickered. Colt didn't wait to see what he'd do with it. He turned back to Eleanor, and his voice dropped just slightly, meant only for her. "Can you walk?" She stared at him. "Can I? Yes, I can walk. I'm not." "Then walk with me, right now, out the door." "I don't know you." "No," he said simply. "You don't." That's not a reassurance. Wasn't meant to be one. It was meant to be honest." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to hurt you. I can't prove that right now. But I need you to decide, and I need you to decide fast, because Whitmore's got 3 hired men in the back of this room, and in about 30 seconds, they're going to remember that they have guns." Eleanor turned her head. She looked at the back of the church. 2 large men near the rear wall, and 1 more by the side door, all 3 of them now watching Whitmore for a signal. She turned back to Colt Mercer. She picked up her bag from beside the altar. She had packed it that morning. She hadn't known why exactly, hadn't let herself think about it too clearly, but she had packed it. A change of clothes. Her mother's locket. The photograph of her father from before the drinking got bad. She had packed it because some stubborn surviving part of her had refused to walk into that church entirely unarmed. "Lead the way," she said. He led the way. They were a 1/4 mile out of town before either of them spoke again. Eleanor's heart was still hammering. She was walking fast to keep up with his stride, her bag slung over one shoulder, the cold Montana air biting at her cheeks, and the adrenaline still bright and strange in her blood. Behind them, Caldwell Creek sat quiet. No hoofbeats. Not yet. "They'll come after us," she said. "Yes." "When?" "Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow morning for certain." He didn't slow down. Whitmore won't let it go. Not because of the money the coins covered the debt. He'll let it go because of what it meant. Somebody walked into his play and flipped the table. He can't leave that unanswered. "So where are we going?" "Up," he said simply, and nodded toward the mountains. Eleanor looked at the mountains, white-capped, enormous, indifferent. "I've never been above the tree line." "I know." "How do you know?" "Because if you had been, you wouldn't have said it like that. You'd have said it like a warning instead of a fact." She looked at him. He was watching the tree line ahead, not her, his expression unreadable. "Who are you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I told you. Colt Mercer." "That's a name, not an answer." He glanced at her, then a quick sideways look that might have held something like surprise. "You're sharper than I expected." "People often underestimate me," she said. "I've stopped taking it personally." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. "Fair enough." He looked forward again. "I'm nobody. I was somebody once before. I came up into these mountains about 10 years ago, and I didn't come back down." "Why not?" "Because there was nothing down here I wanted. And now—" He didn't answer that. She let it sit. They walked. They made camp as the last light was bleeding out of the sky in a hollow between two ridges, where the wind broke and the ground stayed mostly dry. Colt moved with an efficiency that was almost unsettling. Fire laid and lit in less than 4 minutes, bedroll positioned against the wind. The horses settled and picketed before Eleanor had figured out where to put her bag. She sat across the fire from him and watched him work and tried to organize her thoughts, which were considerably harder to organize than she would have liked. She had been auctioned. She had been kissed by a stranger. She had walked out of town with that stranger and was now sitting in the Montana wilderness with no clear plan and no idea what came next. Any rational person would find this alarming. Eleanor found it, and she was not entirely comfortable admitting this even to herself, marginally less terrifying than where she'd been 4 hours ago. "You need to eat," Colt said, without looking up from what he was doing. "I'm not hungry." "Doesn't matter. Eat anyway. Your body's been running on fear all day, and it'll crash hard if you don't give it something." She wanted to argue. She didn't, because he was right. She opened her bag, found the biscuits she'd packed that morning, and ate 2 of them without tasting them. He ate with the same economy of motion that characterized everything else he did. No waste, no ceremony. "Tell me about Whitmore," he said. "What do you want to know?" "How'd he get the debt?" "My father borrowed from him. Several times over several years. I didn't know the full extent of it until after father died." She kept her voice even. She had practice at this by now. "The total was $412. More than the house was worth. More than everything we owned was worth together." And Whitmore's solution was an auction. Whitmore said there were 2 options. "I could sell the property, everything, the land, the house, all of it, and still not cover the full amount. Or I could agree to the auction and the proceeds would settle the debt entirely with a small remainder paid to me." She paused. He presented it very reasonably. He had papers. He had signatures. He had Reverend Aldous already arranged. He'd been planning it for weeks before my father even died, I think. He just needed the death to pull the trigger. Colt's jaw tightened. "He's been doing this to other families. Not always auctions. Sometimes it's land grabs. Sometimes it's forcing sales at a fraction of value. He's been at it for years." He looked at her across the fire. "I didn't come down the mountain for you specifically. I came down because I heard what he was doing, and I'd heard it one too many times. You were just the immediate problem," she said. "I was going to say the first one I could actually stop." She looked at him. "Why does it matter to you? You said yourself you've been up in these mountains for 10 years. You could have stayed." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. "I couldn't." "Why?" "Because I know what it feels like," he said, "to have everything taken and no one step in. And I decided a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to be the person who stepped in, I would be." He said it without drama, without performance, like a man reciting something he'd decided once and never revisited. "That's the whole of it. That's all there is." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "What was taken from you?" The fire snapped. He looked at it. "My wife," he said, 10 years ago, and the life we were building." He didn't elaborate, and the way he said it made it clear he wasn't going to. "Not tonight." She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's old." He stood, moved to check the horses. Over his shoulder, "Get some sleep. We move early." She didn't sleep. Not really. She lay on her bedroll and stared at the stars, and thought about the fact that somewhere in Caldwell Creek, Harold Whitmore was making plans. She didn't doubt it. She knew that man. She knew the particular quality of his patience, not the patience of someone who had accepted a loss, but the patience of someone who was deciding how to recover what he considered his. And she thought about the kiss. She'd been trying not to think about the kiss, which was probably why it kept surfacing. She pressed her fingers to her lips in the dark and tried to be clinical about it. It was a tactic, a transaction. He had kissed her to make a claim visible to the room the same way you'd put your hand on a deed to signal ownership. It had meant nothing. It had been strategy. Except, his hands had been so careful. She kept coming back to that. The rest of him was rough edges and hard angles, and a voice like gravel in a tin pail, but his hands had held her face like she was something he was afraid of breaking. That wasn't strategy. That wasn't calculation. That was something else, and she didn't know what to do with it. Across the camp, Colt's breathing had steadied into sleep. She listened to it for a while, the simple, steady evidence of another person, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for a very long time. She fell asleep before she meant to. She woke to his hand on her shoulder, firm, not rough. "Up," he said quietly. "We've got company." She was on her feet in 3 seconds, heart already racing, and she heard it hoofbeats, still distant but getting less distant. More than one horse, moving with purpose. "How many?" she whispered. 2, maybe 3, moving fast. He was already kicking dirt onto the fire, killing the light. "Grab your bag, leave the bedroll." "The bedroll was my mother's." "Grab your bag," he said again, not unkindly, but with a firmness that brooked no argument. "I'll buy you 10 bedrolls when this is over. Right now we move." She grabbed her bag. She left the bedroll. They moved through the dark together, and Eleanor discovered something she hadn't expected. She trusted him. Not entirely, not yet. But enough. Enough to follow him into the dark when he moved fast, and didn't explain enough to match his pace, without asking where they were going, enough to reach out in the pitch black between trees, and find his coat with her hand and hold on. He felt her hand find his sleeve. He didn't say anything. But he slowed just slightly, just enough to let her keep up, and he didn't pull away. They ran. By dawn they were high enough into the mountains that the air had thinned, and Eleanor's legs were burning, and her breath was coming hard. But the hoofbeats had faded hours ago. Whoever Whitmore had sent, they hadn't followed into the high country. Not in the dark. Not without tracking skills they clearly didn't have. Colt stopped at a ridge that looked out over a vast stretch of valley below. He stood and looked back the way they'd come, reading the landscape with the confidence of someone who had spent a decade learning to read it. Finally he turned. "They'll regroup," he said. "Come back with more men and a tracker. We've got a day, maybe a day and a half. And then we need to be somewhere they can't easily follow." He turned toward the higher country. "I know a place." "Your cabin," she said. He looked at her, slightly surprised again. "You said you had a life up here," she said. "That means shelter. That means somewhere specific." She met his gaze steadily. "Am I wrong?" "No," he said. "You're not wrong." "Then take me there." He studied her for a moment. Something moved in his face, not reluctance exactly. More like a man opening a door he'd kept shut for a very long time, and not being entirely certain what he'd find on the other side. "It's not much," he said finally. "I packed light," she said. "Lead the way." He turned toward the mountains. She fell in step beside him. Above them the Montana sky opened up wide and cold and pitiless and beautiful, and Eleanor Vale walked into it without looking back. She did not know yet what she was walking toward, but she knew with a certainty she couldn't have explained and didn't try to that it was something real. That was enough. For now. That was enough. The cabin was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she had expected, something half collapsed maybe, or barely held together by stubbornness and old timber. What she found instead was solid. 4 walls with no give in them. A roof that looked like it had survived a decade of Montana winters, without complaint. A door that opened smooth and quiet on leather hinges he'd clearly replaced recently. It was small, but it was deliberate. Every inch of it had been thought about. Eleanor stood in the doorway and took it in. Colt moved past her, checked the interior with the habitual sweep of a man who never walked into a space without accounting for it first, then turned back. "It'll do for now," he said. "It's good," she said honestly. "It's better than good." He looked faintly uncomfortable with that, the way a man looks when he's been complimented on something he put real effort into and isn't sure how to receive it. He turned away and started building a fire. Eleanor set her bag down and stood in the middle of that small space and let herself breathe. Really breathe. The kind of breath that goes all the way down, the kind she hadn't managed in weeks. The danger wasn't gone, she knew it clearly. But for this one moment, it was distant, and distant was enough. "Tell me about the men he'll send," she said. "The tracker's name is Deacon Cole." Colt didn't look up from the fire. "He's good. Better than good. I've seen his work before. He can follow a trail 3 days cold in wet ground." He struck the flint. The spark caught. "The other men are hired hands, interchangeable. Cole is the one to worry about. You know him personally. I know of him. He worked for a land company out of Helena a few years back. Did the same kind of work for them, tracking people who'd run from debt, from contracts, from whatever arrangement someone wealthy had decided they were obligated to." The fire steadied. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. "He's not cruel. That almost makes it worse. He's just professional." Eleanor absorbed that. How much time do we actually have? If Whitmore is smart about it, he sends Cole tonight. Cole picks up our trail by mid-morning tomorrow. He paused. But Whitmore will also want to do this quietly. He won't want a scene that draws attention from outside Caldwell Creek. He's built a reputation as a reasonable man. He'll want this handled without it becoming a story that travels. So he'll keep the party small. That's my read. And if we stay here, in the cabin. Colt was quiet for a moment. Cole would find us inside 2 days. Then we can't stay. She said it evenly, not as a lament. Not for long. He finally turned to look at her. But there's something I need to do before we move again. Something I should have done before I came down the mountain and didn't, because I thought I could solve Whitmore's problem with money and speed. He held her gaze. I was wrong. What is it? There's a man named Frank Aldridge. He runs a newspaper out of a town called Bridger's Crossing, about 30 miles east. He's been trying to build a case against Whitmore for 2 years. Land fraud, debt manipulation, forcing sales. He doesn't have enough. What he needs is testimony. Someone willing to speak on record. He watched her face. You. Eleanor was very still for a moment. You want me to walk into a newspaper office and tell a reporter what Whitmore did? Yes. While Whitmore's men are looking for us. Yes. That's your plan. Part of it. She stared at him. Then she laughed, a short, startled sound that surprised even her. You are the strangest man I have ever met. Probably true, he said without any apparent distress about it. All right, she said. Tell me the rest of the plan, he told her. She listened without interrupting, which he seemed to appreciate because when she had questions, she held them until he finished, and then asked them in order which was efficient, and he answered them the same way. By the time they were done, the fire had settled into steady heat, and the last light was gone from the cracks around the shuttered windows. One more question, she said. Go ahead. Why are you doing this? The real reason. Not the answer you gave me last night by the fire. I believe that was true, but I don't think it was complete. She held his gaze across the firelight. You came down the mountain for a reason that had something to do with more than Harold Whitmore and abstract justice. What is it? The silence went long. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. My wife's name was Clara, he said finally. She died 10 years ago, And the way she died, the circumstances of it had Harold Whitmore's fingerprints on it, except I could never prove it. He was different then. Younger, more careful. He left nothing that anyone could point to. His voice was entirely level. That was the worst part. Not grief in it, but something older and colder than grief. I've been in these mountains for 10 years telling myself I was at peace with it, that I'd accepted it, that there was nothing left to do. He looked at her steadily. I was lying to myself. Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment. She let it sit in the room the way the truth sometimes needed to sit before you could put anything around it. So this is about Clara, she said. This is about a lot of things, he said. But yes, some of it is about Clara. And You're not a means to an end, he said with a directness that stopped her mid-sentence. I want to be clear about that. What happened to you yesterday was wrong on its own terms, separate from anything to do with my history. I would have walked into that church regardless. He paused. The fact that it was Whitmore made it easier to walk in, but it wasn't the reason. She nodded slowly. She believed him. She wasn't sure why she believed him as completely as she did. She'd known this man for less than 24 hours, but the certainty was there, unasked for and inconvenient and real. Get some sleep, she said. I'll take first watch. He looked at her. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. I want to. She met his gaze calmly. I'm not helpless, Colt. I know you know that, but I want to make sure we're both operating from the same understanding. I'm your partner in this, not your passenger. The word landed in the room. He looked at her with that unreadable expression for 3 long seconds. Partner, he repeated. Partner, she confirmed. Something shifted in his face, subtle, like a lock turning. All right, he said. And she understood that it meant more than agreement about a watch schedule. The sound came just before 3 in the morning. Eleanor was sitting with her back against the wall by the window, fully awake, when she heard it, a horse moving slowly, picking its way with deliberate quiet up the trail toward the cabin. One horse. One rider. Moving like someone who didn't want to be heard. She had Colt's shoulder in her hand before the thought fully formed. He came awake fast and silent, the way men do who have spent years sleeping in places where slow and loud could get you killed. She put her lips close to his ear. One rider, moving careful, coming up the south trail. He was on his feet in 2 seconds. He went to the window, listened. Then he turned to her with his expression tight and his voice barely above a breath. That's not one of Whitmore's men. How do you know? Because Whitmore's men don't know the South Trail. Nobody knows the South Trail. He moved to the door. Stay here. She did not stay there. She followed him out into the cold dark, close enough to touch, and they stood together in the black silence, while the hoofbeats got closer, and then stopped. A voice came out of the dark. Old, careful. Hands clearly up based on the sound of it. Colt Mercer, I know you're standing there. I've been riding for 6 hours, and I'm older than I look, and I would very much appreciate not getting shot. Colt was still for a beat. Then low, Harlan. In the flesh. Considerably more saddle-sore flesh than when you last saw it. Colt moved forward. Eleanor stayed close. A man materialized from the dark 60 or so lean with the bearing of someone who had once been formidable and still retained most of it. He was on a gray horse, and his hands were indeed visible. His eyes found Eleanor with a sharp intelligence that didn't match the exhausted hunch of his posture. This her? He asked. Yes, said Colt. She the reason you finally came down? Colt said nothing. Harlan looked at Eleanor directly. Ma'am, I'm Harlan Voss. I was a deputy United States Marshal for 22 years until my knees disagreed. I've been keeping an informal watch on Harold Whitmore for going on 3 years at Colt's request. He paused. I came to tell you both that there's a warrant being drawn up in Helena for Whitmore. Federal, not county, which matters because county law in Caldwell Creek has been in Whitmore's pocket for years. He looked at Colt. 2 days, maybe 3. That's how long it takes for the warrant to be signed and a marshal to ride out. The silence was thick. 2 days, Colt said. 48 hours. 50 at the most. Harlan's voice was steady. Whitmore doesn't know about the warrant. Nobody in Caldwell Creek does. If you can keep yourselves breathing and out of his reach for 2 days, this ends legally instead of ugly. Eleanor's heart was hammering. What changed? You said 3 years you've been watching him. What changed to get a federal warrant? Harlan looked at her with something that might have been respect. You did, he said simply. The auction. Half a dozen witnesses from outside Caldwell Creek happened to be in that church yesterday, traveling merchants, a circuit pastor, a woman who writes for a church newsletter in Helena. The story traveled last night. Fast. He turned to include Colt. By this morning, it had reached people in Helena who have been looking for a reason to move on Whitmore for a year. The auction gave them the public incident they needed to justify federal intervention without looking like overreach. So we're the spark, Eleanor said quietly. You're the spark, Harlan confirmed. Whether the fire catches depends on whether you're still alive and willing to testify in 48 hours. Another silence. Then Colt said, Cole's coming. Harlan nodded. I know. He's already got your trail, picked it up an hour ago by my count. He's moving slow because he doesn't want to come at you in the dark. He'll push hard at first light. His eyes moved between them. You need to not be here when the sun comes up. Colt turned to Eleanor. He didn't say anything. He looked at her with that direct, clear gaze, and she understood the question he was asking without words. This changes the stakes. This is real and dangerous, and it ends in a federal courtroom, or it doesn't end cleanly at all. Are you still in? She had left a bedroll on a mountainside. She had walked through the dark, holding onto a stranger's coat. She had listened to a man confess 10 years of grief over a dead wife in front of a campfire, and trusted that the grief was real, and that the man was trustworthy based on nothing more than instinct and the particular way he'd held her face when he kissed her. I'm still in, she said, aloud directly, so there was no ambiguity. Harlan looked at her for a moment. Then he said to Colt, I like her. I know, said Colt. And there was something in his voice that he probably didn't intend to put there. Something warm and slightly off balance and very human. They left the cabin 40 minutes later in the dark, moving fast and light. Harlan came with them. He claimed his knees would hold for another day before they staged a full revolt, and the three of them moved through the high country, with Colt leading Eleanor in the middle. Harlan's old horse picking its way carefully at the rear. Eleanor had stopped counting her surprises. She had decided that in this particular stretch of time on this particular mountain, things were simply going to keep happening faster than she could categorize them, and the most useful thing she could do was remain present and alert and stop expecting the pace to slow down. Tell me about Bridger's Crossing, she said to Colt's back, keeping her voice low, matching her stride to his. The newspaper. The man. Frank Aldridge, 63, ran newspapers in Kansas and Wyoming before he came to Montana. Honest, which in his business means he's been broke 3 times and threatened twice. He moved around a tree without breaking pace. He'll treat you fairly. He'll also push you hard. He'll want every detail, every date, everything Whitmore said, and when and who was present. You'll need to be specific. I have a good memory. Good. I remembered every cent of the debt. Every conversation with Whitmore, word for word. I wrote it down the night after each one, because something about him always made me want a record. She paused. I have the pages. They're in my bag. He stopped walking, just stopped mid-stride and turned to look at her. You have written records. Yes. Contemporaneous. Dated. Yes. She studied his expression. Is that significant? Eleanor. His voice had gone very quiet. That's not significant. That's everything. Oral testimony is valuable. Written records dated at the time of the events, that's a federal prosecutor's answer to every defense argument Whitmore's lawyer will make. He stared at her. "You've been carrying that in your bag this whole time." "I didn't know it was important. I kept records because it felt like the only power I had. The only way to make sure that whatever happened there would be at least one document that said what was true." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark. Then he said very quietly, so quietly she almost missed it, "Clara would have done that too." She didn't respond. She didn't think he'd meant to say it out loud. She let it pass like a bird overhead, noted, acknowledged, allowed to keep moving. They walked on. Macham. Deacon Cole found the cabin at first light. Eleanor knew this because Harlan, who had been riding rear guard with the particular vigilance of a man who'd spent 22 years keeping himself alive, reported it an hour after sunrise with the calm of a weather report. "He's at the cabin, half-hour behind us, give or take." He didn't sound alarmed. "He's good. He won't need long to pick up the trail again." "How many with him?" Colt asked. 3 plus Cole. 2 of them are Whitmore's regulars. The third one, I don't recognize. Big man moves like military. Harlan's eyes narrowed slightly. "That third one worries me more than Cole." Eleanor filed that away. "How far to Bridger's Crossing?" "At this pace, 6 hours, Colt said. "And Cole will be how far behind us when we get there?" Colt and Harlan exchanged a look that they probably thought was subtle. 2 hours, Colt said. "Maybe less. So we arrive. I give my statement, we get out of town before Cole walks in." "That's the shape of it." "Then we should move faster," she said. And she didn't wait for a response before she picked up the pace. Harlan made a sound behind her that she suspected was a laugh. 2 hours out from Bridger's Crossing. The unknown third man made his move. There was no preamble, no warning shot, just the sudden crash of a body coming out of the tree line at a dead run and hitting Colt from the side with enough force to take them both down hard. Eleanor heard the impact, spun, and had 3 seconds to assess the situation. Big man, exactly as Harlan described, military efficient, going for Colt's gun hand with both of his. Harlan's horse reared. Harlan swore in a register that suggested considerable experience with the expression. Eleanor did not stand still and wait to see how this resolved. She dropped her bag. She looked for something solid. The first thing that came to hand was a branch, thick green wood, heavy. She didn't think about it. She moved forward and she swung it. It caught the big man across the back of the shoulders. Not hard enough to stop him, but hard enough to break his focus for the half-second Colt needed. Colt got his right hand free. The big man twisted toward Eleanor, and she saw his face, young, hard-focused, and now surprised, because clearly nobody had told him the woman was going to fight, and then Colt was up, and the dynamic shifted with the brutal speed of people who know what they're doing, and 30 seconds later, the big man was face down in the dirt, with his hands behind his back, and Colt's knee between his shoulder blades. Eleanor was breathing hard. The branch was still in her hand. She looked at it for a moment, and then set it down with a care that was slightly at odds with the situation. Harlan had his horse under control. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the branch. 6 hours to Bridger's Crossing, he said in a tone of mild reflection. "And she's already swinging lumber." "Shut up, Harlan," Colt said, but the tightness in his voice wasn't anger. He looked up at Eleanor from the ground, his knee still on the man beneath him, and his expression was the most unguarded she'd seen it yet. Something close to startled. Something closer to moved. "You all right?" "Fine," she said. She sounded steadier than she felt. "What do we do with him?" "Tie him. Leave him with a note telling any passing rider where he is. Cole will find him before he needs rescuing, which means Cole knows we know he's coming, which means Cole will slow down." He stood hauling the man up by his collar. "It also means we need to move, right now. Fast." "Then let's move," she said, and she picked up her bag, and she fell in step, and she did not let her hands shake until she had walked far enough that nobody could see them do it. She was not frightened exactly. Or rather, she was frightened, but the fear was clean. It was the kind of fear that came from being in real danger, rather than the slow, suffocating kind that came from being powerless. This fear had a direction. This fear had an action attached to it. She found she could work with that. They reached Bridger's Crossing in the late afternoon, road dirty and moving fast, and Frank Aldridge took one look at the three of them standing in his newspaper office and closed the front door and locked it without being asked. He was exactly as Colt had described 63 lean, with the permanently ink-stained fingers of a man who'd spent 4 decades setting type by hand, and the eyes of someone who had been lied to enough times to develop a fine sensitivity for the opposite. He looked at Eleanor. "You're the woman from the auction." "Yes." "You have testimony." "I have more than testimony." She opened her bag and placed the pages on his desk. Dated. Detailed. Every conversation, every amount, every veiled threat, wrapped in the language of reasonable business. She watched his face as he read the first page, then the second. He looked up. "How many pages?" 14. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been trying to break Harold Whitmore for 3 years." He looked at the pages again. "You did it in a bag." "I didn't know I was doing it," she said. "I was just trying to remember what was true." Aldridge looked at her with the expression of a man who had occasionally lost faith in humanity and was in the process of recovering some of it. "Give me 2 hours," he said. "I'll have a full written account on record and copies made for the federal marshal's office. I know who's handling the Helena warrant." He looked at Colt. "She testifies before the week is out. Whitmore doesn't see the other side of it." Eleanor's heart was beating hard and strange. Not fear this time. Something else. Something that felt, and she hadn't felt this in a very long time, something that felt like agency, like the world bending in response to something she had done. 2 hours, she said. Then what? Harlan answered that one from the corner of the room, where he'd been leaning against the wall, with his arms crossed, looking like a man who had earned the right to lean. "Then Cole walks into Bridger's Crossing, and we need to be ready for that conversation." Colt had gone still in the particular way he went still when he was thinking several moves ahead. He looked at Harlan. "You think Cole can be reasoned with?" "I think Cole is a professional," Harlan said. "And professionals, when you show them the warrant is already signed and the federal marshal is 2 days out and their employer is about to be arrested, sometimes make choices in their own interest. And if he doesn't..." Harlan unfolded his arms, straightened up, fixed Colt with a look that was completely without drama. "Then we handle it the other way." Eleanor looked at the pages on Aldridge's desk. 14 pages of truth that she'd carried in her bag across a mountain through the dark past a man in the dirt. 14 pages that she'd written by candlelight in a house full of grief, not knowing what they were for, just knowing that truth needed to be recorded somewhere. She pulled her chair up to Aldridge's desk. "Let's start," she said. And she began to talk. She talked for 90 minutes straight. Frank Aldridge wrote everything down with a speed that suggested he'd been waiting for this conversation for years, which in a sense he had. He asked good questions, precise, not leading the kind that opened a door rather than built one, and Eleanor answered them the same way she'd packed that bag the morning of the auction, methodically, without sentimentality, with the specific detail that turned a story into a record. Dates. Amounts. The exact words Whitmore had used when he'd come to the house 3 days after her father's funeral. His hat in his hand, and his face arranged into something that resembled sympathy, and wasn't. She remembered it all. She'd written it down. The writing had fixed it in her the way frostbite fixes cold, permanent crystalline absolutely clear. Colt stood at the window the entire time she talked. He didn't interrupt. He didn't pace. He stood with his arms folded and his eyes on the street, and he listened. And Eleanor was aware of his listening, the way you're aware of something solid at your back, a wall, a foundation. It didn't comfort her exactly because she didn't need comforting. It steadied her. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. Harlan had taken a chair by the door and closed his eyes, though Eleanor suspected he was not actually sleeping. His breathing was too controlled for sleep. Aldridge set his pen down when she finished. He looked at the pages she'd brought him, and then at the new pages he'd filled, and his expression was that of a man doing arithmetic in his head and arriving at a number he'd been hoping for. "This is enough," he said. "This is more than enough. With the warrant coming out of Helena and your written records as evidence, a good federal prosecutor buries Whitmore before a jury deliberates for an hour." He gathered the pages carefully like they were fragile, which in a certain sense they were. "I'm going to make 3 copies. One goes to the marshal. One I keep locked here. One I send tonight on the evening stage to a colleague in Helena who has been waiting for something exactly like this." He looked at Eleanor directly. "You understand what happens when this becomes public? Whitmore will know. His lawyers will know. Whatever protection he has in Caldwell Creek gets stripped away the moment this prints." "I understand," she said. "He'll come after you harder." "He's already coming hard," she said. "I'd rather be a target worth targeting than stay quiet and pretend otherwise." Aldridge looked at Colt. "Marry her," he said simply, and went back to his writing. Colt said nothing. But Eleanor heard his sharp intake of breath, and she did not look at him, and she was grateful for the discipline that kept her face still, because something in her chest had done something entirely unasked for at those 2 words, and she needed a moment to put it back where it belonged. The door rattled. Not a knock. A deliberate try of the latch, slow and testing. Everyone in the room went still. Then a voice calm from the other side. "Mr. Aldridge, I know you're in there. I can see the lamp. I'm going to ask that you open the door." Colt moved away from the window. His hand went to his gun without drama, a simple fact of physics. Harlan opened his eyes. He looked completely awake. He had apparently been listening with perfect attention the entire time. "Cole," he said to no one in particular. Eleanor stood. She did not step back. She stepped forward beside Colt, and when he glanced at her sideways, she met the glance steadily, and he did not tell her to move. Harlan got to his feet, rolled his shoulders once with the grunt of a man whose body had been protesting for hours, and went to the door. He put his hand on the lock and raised his voice just enough to carry. "Deacon, it's Harlan Voss." A beat of silence. Then, "I heard you were retired." "I heard the same thing." Harlan turned the lock. "Come in slow, both hands visible, and your men stay on their horses." The door opened. Deacon Cole walked in exactly as described, both hands at chest height, unhurried with the careful manner of someone who had learned that the fastest way through a tense situation was usually not to accelerate it. He was younger than Eleanor had imagined. Mid-40s maybe. Clean-shaven. Watchful in a way that wasn't threatening because it was so completely unsurprised a man who had seen a considerable amount and stopped being startled by any of it. His eyes moved across the room in one systematic pass. Aldridge at the desk. Harlan by the door. Colt by the window, hand on his gun. Eleanor standing between them, which clearly registered as unexpected because he paused on her for a beat longer than the others before moving on. "I see you left Garrett tied to a tree up the mountain," he said to Colt. "He should have stayed in town," Colt said. "He gets ahead of himself." Cole's voice held no particular blame. He looked at the pages on Aldridge's desk. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it adjusted the subtle recalibration of someone updating a calculation. "That's the testimony." "And the records," Eleanor said. "Written the night of each conversation. Dated, signed, kept private. Until now." Cole looked at her. Then he said with what seemed like genuine curiosity, "How long have you been building that file?" 2 years, she said. "Since the second time Whitmore came to my father with a loan offer that wasn't really an offer." Cole was quiet for a moment. He looked at Harlan. "The warrant. Signed in Helena, federal. Marshal rides out in 48 hours. Harlan said it the way he said everything, plain direct, letting the facts do the work. "It's done, Deacon. The frame's already set. You're standing in a room where the story is already written and your employer is already the villain in it." Silence. Cole stood in that silence with a stillness that was particular to men who had been in a lot of dangerous rooms and learned to think instead of react. "Whitmore has 3 lawyers, he said finally. "He had 3 lawyers, Aldridge said from the desk without looking up from his copying. "Federal prosecution with contemporaneous written evidence and multiple witnesses makes lawyers nervous. Nervous lawyers start looking at their own exposure. Cole exhaled through his nose. It wasn't resignation exactly. It was the sound of a man letting go of a job that had already become something other than what he'd agreed to. "I want it on record," he said, "that I was hired for tracking, not for anything that happened on that mountain this morning." "On record how?" Eleanor asked. He looked at her. "However your friend with the newspaper wants to put it." Aldridge looked up then. He studied Cole for a moment with the evaluating gaze of a man who had interviewed a lot of people and developed strong instincts about which of them were telling the truth. "Sit down," he said finally. "I've got a fresh page." Cole sat down. Eleanor sat too in the chair beside the desk and watched Cole's face while he talked and understood something that she found unexpectedly useful. Whitmore's hired men were not loyal. They were contracted. There was a difference, and the difference meant that as Whitmore's position collapsed, the people around him would not go down with the structure. They would step away from it, professionally, without drama. Which meant Whitmore, when the end came, would face it with considerably less support than he currently believed he had. She tucked that away. She had a feeling she'd need it. They slept in Bridger's Crossing that night. Aldridge had a storeroom at the back of his building, not comfortable exactly, but dry and private and lockable, which were the relevant features. Eleanor got the cot. Colt and Harlan took the floor without discussion, with the ease of men who had slept on, considerably worse. Harlan went to sleep with a speed that suggested a man entirely at peace with his conscience. His snoring was immediate and prodigious. Eleanor lay on the cot and listened to it and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Aldridge had said. Marry her. 2 words offhand from a man who barely knew either of them. She'd known it was a practical observation, or at least it had been framed as one. In the frontier, a married woman had legal standing that an unmarried woman didn't. A wife had protections that a woman alone didn't have. Aldridge had probably meant it as pure pragmatics. Probably. "You're not sleeping," Colt said from the floor. She turned her head toward the sound. It was very dark. "Neither are you." "Harlan drowns it out." She almost smiled. "Yes, he does." She turned onto her back again. "What happens after the marshal arrives? After Whitmore is arrested and the case goes to trial?" A pause. "Depends on how clean the prosecution is. Months probably. Possibly a year before it resolves. And until then, Whitmore is dangerous. Cornered men are always more dangerous than comfortable ones." He was quiet for a moment. "You shouldn't go back to Caldwell Creek. Not until it's over." "I know." She had known it from the moment she'd walked out of that church. Some doors, once you walked through them, didn't open from the other side. "Where then?" Another pause. Longer. "The cabin," he said finally. "It's secure. Cole knows where it is now, but Cole is no longer a problem. No one else knows the approach trails." His voice was measured, careful. "It's not a permanent arrangement. It's until the trial." "Your cabin," she said. "Yes." "That you've lived in alone for 10 years?" "Yes." She let that sit for a moment. "And you're certain that's what you want?" The silence went on long enough that she wondered if he would answer. Then he said in a voice that had dropped to something very quiet, "I'm certain of considerably more than I expected to be 12 hours ago." She felt the warmth of that move through her without permission, starting in her chest and spreading outward. She didn't examine it. She let it happen. "All right," she said. "The cabin." "All right," he said. Harlan snored. The lamp guttered. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted and resettled, and the night held them all in a silence that was, for the first time in days, something close to peaceful. She was dreaming when the window exploded inward. Glass, cold air, the crash of the shutter ripping off its hinge, and then a man coming through the frame. Not Cole, not anyone she recognized. Someone new and fast, and already moving toward her before she'd fully registered what was happening. She rolled off the cot, purely on instinct, and hit the floor hard, and she heard Colt come up from sleep the same instant, and the room became very loud and very dark and very fast all at once. The intruder had a lamp. He lit it on the way down from the window frame, which meant this was planned, which meant he'd had time outside to prepare. And in the sudden light, Eleanor saw three things simultaneously. The man's face young and set with the particular blankness of someone who has committed to a course of action. Harlan already on his feet with his gun up. Colt between Eleanor and the intruder, placing himself there without apparent thought, as if it were simply where he belonged. "Whitmore wants the pages," the man said. His voice shook, which meant he was scared, which made him more dangerous, not less. Scared men with guns were the most volatile thing Eleanor knew of. "Give me the pages and I walk out, that's all." "Pages are gone," Aldridge said from the doorway to the main office. His voice was entirely steady, and Eleanor had a sudden profound appreciation for men of 63, who had been threatened twice before, and apparently used up all their fear the first 2 times. "Copied and staged for Morning Post 3 hours ago. There's nothing here to take." The young man's hand tightened on his gun. "You're lying." "Son," said Harlan, in the tone of a man who had talked a considerable number of people down from terrible decisions. "Look at this room. Look at the 4 people in it who are all pointing guns at you right now, including the woman. Think carefully about what you're going to do next." Eleanor looked down. She had, at some point during the scramble, picked up the pistol from her bag that she had not yet mentioned she owned. It was in her hand. She was pointing it at the young man with a steadiness that surprised her almost as much as it surprised him. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Put it down," she said quietly. "Whatever he's paying you isn't worth what comes next." Something in the young man cracked. It was visible a sudden fragility moving through the set of his face, the held-together look of someone who had pushed past his own limits and arrived at the far side of them exhausted. He was 20, maybe 21. He was shaking in earnest now. He lowered his gun. Harlan crossed the room in 4 steps and took it from him with the professional efficiency of a man who'd done this many times. The young man sat down on the floor without being told to and put his head in his hands. "Name," said Harlan. "Jeb Purvis." "Whitmore send you." A pause. Then muffled through his hands. "Yes, sir." "How many others?" "Just me." He looked up. His eyes were red. "He said it would be easy. He said they'd all be asleep." Colt looked at the boy on the floor for a moment. Then he looked at the broken window and at the cold air coming through it, and at Eleanor still standing with the pistol in her hand. His expression was complex, the particular complexity of a man who has seen something in a person that he didn't entirely anticipate, and isn't quite sure what to do with the fact that he is moved by it. "Put the gun down, Eleanor," he said gently. She lowered it, set it carefully on the cot. Her hands were steady. She noticed this with a kind of distant interest, the way you notice something about yourself that you didn't previously know. "You had a gun in your bag this whole time," Colt said. Not accusing, somewhere between surprised and something else. "My father gave it to me when I was 18, she said. He said a woman alone needed to be able to make her own argument. She straightened her coat. "I've never fired it at a person. I wasn't entirely sure I could." "Could you have?" He was watching her carefully. She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "If I had to." "Yes." He held her gaze for one long waited moment. And in that moment, something settled between them that hadn't been there before. Not a declaration, not a gesture, just a mutual recognition. The kind that doesn't need words, because the words would only make it smaller. He saw her, clearly and fully, and without the patronizing filter men so often applied without knowing they were doing it. He saw what she was, and he was not frightened by it, or diminished by it, or uncertain about it. He was, if anything, more certain than he'd been before. "All right," he said, and turned to deal with the boy on the floor. Gig. Dawn broke cold and fast, and they were already moving when it did, because staying in Bridger's Crossing a second full day was no longer a reasonable calculation. Aldridge had sent his packets on the first stage. Young Jeb Purvis was handed to the local sheriff with a written account of the night's events, and Cole's earlier deposition, which gave the sheriff enough reason to hold the boy and enough reason to send his own wire to Helena. The frame was tightening around Whitmore from 3 directions now, and every hour that passed made it tighter. But Whitmore knew it too. That was the part that stayed in Eleanor's chest like a cold stone as they rode out of Bridger's Crossing in the gray morning light. A man who could see his world collapsing was a man with nothing left to lose, and nothing left to lose was the most dangerous condition she knew. "He'll move directly now," she said to Colt, riding beside him, while Harlan brought up the rear. "Forget subtlety. He knows the warrant is coming. He knows I've testified. He knows his men have been talking." She thought it through aloud. "What does he do?" "He runs," Harlan said from behind them. "Or he makes one last move." "Which is more like him?" she asked. Colt was quiet for a moment. "He's not a man who runs," he said. "I've known men like him my whole life. They build too much. Their identity is in the structure, the money, the respect, the control. Take that away, and there's nothing left of them to run with." He looked straight ahead. "He'll make a move. At us. At you," he said. "Specifically. You're the testimony. You're the written records. You're the woman he stood up in front of the town and tried to sell, and who walked away and brought the whole thing down instead." His voice was measured, but not cold. "You're personal to him now." She took that in. "Then we should stop waiting for him to choose the time and place." Colt looked at her. "We know he'll come," she said. "We know he'll come hard, and without caution, because he has nothing left to be cautious about. We know he'll come at me specifically." She met his gaze. "That means we know more than he thinks we know. That's an advantage. I'd rather use it than ignore it." Harlan made a sound. "I keep saying I like her. You keep saying it," Colt agreed, and this time there was nothing involuntary about what was in his voice. He meant it to be there. He looked at Eleanor steadily. "All right. Tell me what you're thinking," she told him. He listened. And somewhere behind them, down through the mountain passes and back across the valley they'd run through in the dark. 3 days ago, Harold Whitmore was making his own plans in a town that was already beginning to whisper his name differently, not with deference anymore, but with the specific shift in tone that meant the ground had moved and everyone could feel it. He didn't know yet what was already moving toward him. He didn't know the shape of what was coming, but Eleanor Vale did. She had built it page by page in the small hours of a grief-filled house, with a candle and a steady hand, and the stubborn conviction that truth recorded was truth preserved. She had carried it in a bag across a mountain. She had said it aloud in a locked newspaper office, while a tracker listened and a former marshal took notes. She had held a gun steady in a broken-windowed room at 3 a.m, and found to her own clear-eyed surprise that she was still standing. The marshal was 1 day out. Whitmore had 1 day left, and Eleanor Vale was done being the person things happened to. She rode toward the mountains with her back straight and her jaw set, and the cold morning air sharp in her lungs, and she did not look behind her. The plan was Eleanor's, and it was either very smart or very dangerous, and Colt had spent the last 2 hours of riding trying to determine which. He had not yet arrived at a satisfying answer which told him it was probably both. The shape of it was simple. Whitmore would come for her. They had established that they believed it, and they were going to use it. Rather than keep moving and let him choose the terrain and the timing, they would go back. Not to Caldwell Creek, not fully. But close enough that word would reach Whitmore that Eleanor Vale had been seen riding in from the east. Close enough that a man with nothing left to lose would feel the pull of one last move before the walls closed in, and when he came, they would be ready. "You're bait," Harlan had said flatly when she finished explaining it. "I'm the hook," she'd corrected. "There's a difference. The fish doesn't think so. I'm not the fish." Harlan had looked at Colt. Colt had looked at Eleanor. And Eleanor had looked back at both of them with an expression so thoroughly composed and clear-eyed that arguing with it felt like arguing with a fact of nature. "The marshal is 1 day out," she had said. That means Whitmore has 1 day to act before federal authority makes everything else irrelevant. He will act. We all know he will act. The only question is whether we shape the circumstances or let him shape them. A pause. I spent 2 years being shaped by Harold Whitmore's circumstances. I'm done with that arrangement. So now they were riding back, and Colt was thinking about how much had changed in 3 days, and how little time he'd had to track any of it while it was happening. He thought about her hand on his sleeve in the dark. He thought about the branch and the gun she'd been carrying since she was 18, and the 14 pages of truth she'd kept for 2 years, not knowing they were ammunition. He thought about the way she'd said, "I'm your partner, not your passenger," with the absolute calm of someone stating a fact rather than making a demand. He thought about Clara. He thought about the 10 years he'd spent telling himself that solitude was a reasonable response to loss, and about how it had taken Eleanor Vale approximately 48 hours to make that argument feel considerably less convincing. He didn't know what to do with any of it. Not yet. There was a man with resources and desperation between him and the chance to figure it out, and that man required his full attention. But Colt was aware in the specific, inconvenient way of someone who has lived in his own head long enough to recognize an honest feeling when it arrives that the feelings were there. Real and unasked for, and growing in the particular way of things that have been deprived of room for too long and are now taking up the space they need. He kept that to himself. He rode. "Someone's coming," Harlan said from behind them. Not hoofbeats this time. A single rider moving at a gallop from the direction of Caldwell Creek, running the horse harder than the horse appreciated, and not slowing as the distance closed. Colt had his hand on his gun before the identification came. The rider pulled up sharp 30 feet out, breathing hard and resolved into a woman in her 50s in a traveling coat with her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked at Eleanor with an expression of pure and complicated relief. "Mrs. Hatch," Eleanor said, and her voice did something it almost never did. It cracked. Just slightly. Just for a second. "What are you doing out here?" "Looking for you," the woman said. She was breathing hard. She'd ridden fast. "Child, I have been looking for you since yesterday morning, and I want it on record that I am too old for this much galloping." She looked at Colt with the frank appraisal of a woman who had taught half a town to read and developed strong opinions about character along the way. Then she looked back at Eleanor. "Whitmore is gone." The silence that followed had a specific quality, not stunned but recalibrating. Like a room where the temperature just shifted without warning. "Gone," Colt said. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning he left. Last night after dark. He took 2 horses, a packed wagon, and what I am told was a considerable amount of cash that had been sitting in his personal safe." Mrs. Hatch straightened in the saddle. "He also took his ledgers." Eleanor went very still. "Which ledgers?" "The ones from the bank. His personal accounts, the loan records." Mrs. Hatch held Eleanor's gaze. "All of them." The cold thing was back in Eleanor's chest. Not fear. Calculation. Without those ledgers, the federal case loses its paper trail. My testimony stands, my records stand, but a good defense lawyer argues that the bank documents tell a different story, and the jury never sees them because they don't exist anymore. "That's my read too," Harlan said, and his voice had gone flat and careful. "He's not running," Colt said. "He's clearing the board. He takes the ledgers out of reach, makes it a testimony versus testimony case, and then he comes for Eleanor to remove the testimony." He looked at Mrs. Hatch. "How long ago did he leave?" 8, maybe 9 hours. I came as fast as I could." Colt did the arithmetic. Whitmore had a 9-hour head start with a wagon, which meant he was slower than horses, but had had all night to choose his direction and disappear into it. "Which way did he go?" Mrs. Hatch hesitated. It was a specific hesitation, the kind that meant she had information she was deciding whether to share, not because she was withholding it, but because she understood that sharing it had weight. "North," she said, "toward the Hargrove Pass." Colt went completely still. Eleanor looked at him. The change in him was immediate and visible. a sudden sharpening like a lens coming into focus, and beneath it, something older and harder that she'd seen a glimpse of before and hadn't been able to name. She named it now, recognition. The particular recognition of someone who had been waiting for a specific piece of information for 10 years. "Colt," she said quietly. "Hargrove Pass," he said, and his voice was level in the way that things go level when the emotion underneath them is very large and being controlled very deliberately, "is where my wife died." Nobody spoke. "There's a relay station up there. Old. It's been abandoned for years, but it's solid. Whitmore knows it because he used it. My father told me he used it back when—" He stopped. Started again. "It's the one place in this territory that Whitmore knows better than I do. He thinks." His jaw tightened. "He's wrong about that." "He's drawing you there," Harlan said. Not a question. "Yes. He knows what Clara means to you. He knows if he goes north you'll follow regardless of—" Harlan stopped. "Colt. I know what you're going to say." "Then I'll say it anyway. This is what he wants. He knows you. He's been watching your family since before your father died. He knows that if there is one thing that will make Colt Mercer stop thinking clearly, it's, I said, I know." His voice had an edge now, clean and hard like a blade that hasn't rusted. He turned to look at Eleanor, and his expression did something complicated and painful. "This is a trap." "Yes," she said simply. "He wants me to go north so he has time to circle back and come at me while you're chasing him." She said it calmly. "I know. I worked it out when you went still." She held his gaze. "So we don't separate. That's the one thing we don't do." He stared at her. "Eleanor." "We go north together," she said. "All of us. Harlan, Mrs. Hatch." "I am absolutely coming," said Mrs. Hatch with a firmness that precluded discussion. "And we go to Hargrove Pass together, and we get the ledgers, and we get Whitmore, and we do not split up, because splitting up is exactly what he is counting on." She took one step toward him. "I know what Clara means. I know that pull you're feeling right now is real, and it's not weakness, it's human. But I need you to stay with me. I need your head here, not in what happened 10 years ago." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, raw and real, and not entirely in his control. "You are the most—" He stopped. Shook his head once. "All right. Together." "Together," Harlan confirmed, already turning his horse north. Gagged. They rode hard, and the land got rougher as they climbed, and Eleanor felt the altitude in her lungs and the hours in her legs, and she pushed past both of them because the arithmetic was simple. Whitmore had 9 hours and a wagon, which meant he'd arrived at Hargrove well before dawn, which meant he'd had time to rest and prepare while they were still riding. The one advantage they had was numbers, and the fact that he didn't know Mrs. Hatch had reached them. He thought he'd created a neat choice between the North and Eleanor. He didn't know they'd refuse to be divided. She thought about his face at the auction, the satisfaction in it, the absolute assurance that the world arranged itself according to his design, that people were pieces. He moved, that money and position were a kind of gravity, and everything fell toward them eventually. She had watched him at her father's funeral. She hadn't wanted to, but he'd been there because of course he had, and she'd seen how he stood the particular quality of his stillness, and she'd understood even then that he wasn't grieving. He was calculating. He was waiting for the next move in a game that her father's death had already decided in his favor. She had not been able to stop that. She had been alone and overwhelmed, and the world had been moving too fast in the wrong direction. She had been able to do exactly one thing, and she had done it. She had written it down, every word, every date, and she had kept writing even when it felt pointless, even when there was no clear reason to believe it would ever matter to anyone. It had mattered. It mattered now. She rode. Hey. The relay station sat at the top of the pass, and they heard the wagon before they saw it, or rather Harlan heard it because Harlan heard everything. And he raised his fist, and they all pulled up in the same moment. "He's still here," Harlan said quietly. "Wagon hasn't moved." Either he's waiting or... He tilted his head, listening. 2 horses inside the structure. Could be more outside that I can't place. 1 man with him, Colt said. At least. He doesn't go anywhere alone since yesterday. Mrs. Hatch was breathing controlled and deliberate beside Eleanor. And Eleanor felt a sudden fierce affection for this woman, who had taught her to read and ridden 9 hours of hard trail to find her, and was now sitting at the top of a Montana mountain pass, preparing for a confrontation with a corrupt banker with no evident sign of reconsidering any of it. "What's the structure?" Eleanor asked. "Main room, back room, loft," Colt said. He knew it. Of course he knew it. He had been here before under entirely different circumstances, in a different life. His voice was controlled, but his jaw was tight. 1 door front, 2 windows left and right of the door. The loft has a gap in the front wall, not a window, just a gap where a board rotted out. Someone up there has a clear line on the approach. "Then we don't approach from the front," she said. "There's a side wall," he said. "No windows on the north side. Old loading entrance sealed over, but the wood is rotten enough that—" "Show me," she said. He did. They left the horses with Mrs. Hatch, who accepted this assignment without comment, and the 3 of them, Colt, Eleanor, Harlan, moved through the cold morning air toward the north wall, which was everything Colt had said it was, and slightly worse. The sealed loading door had been boarded over with planks that had experienced 15 Montana winters, and they gave with a pressure that was more sad than forceful the simple surrender of wood that had been holding on out of habit rather than structural integrity. They were inside. The back room. Dark, cold smelling of old hay and abandonment. The voices from the main room were clear through the thin interior wall. "Not going to hold," said a voice Eleanor didn't recognize, one of Whitmore's men. "The marshal is coming, Harold. The whole thing is manageable," Whitmore said, and Eleanor felt the hair rise on her arms because she had not heard his voice in 4 days, and she had almost forgotten the specific quality of it, the absolute unruffled certainty, like a man describing geography. If the testimony doesn't exist, the records don't exist, the paper trail is here. A sound, the flat slap of ledger books on a surface. My lawyers reconstruct a different narrative. Mercer is a mountain lunatic with a grudge. The woman is a grieving daughter who misunderstood routine banking practice. The federal case collapses for lack of corroborating documentation. And if she talks anyway. "People talk," Whitmore said. "Courts require evidence." A beat of silence from the unknown man. Then, "And Mercer." Whitmore's pause was only half a second. "Mercer follows his grief north, and we have a tragic accident in the mountains." The words came out smooth and level. It wouldn't be the first time. Colt went absolutely rigid beside Eleanor. She felt it rather than saw it, the full-body stillness of a man who has just received the confirmation of something he has suspected for 10 years and is dealing with the consequences of that confirmation landing in real time. She put her hand on his arm. Not pulling him back, just present, just contact. He didn't move. She leaned close to his ear. "I heard it," she breathed. So did Harlan. Harlan's face in the dark was that of a man who had just added something to a list he'd been keeping for a long time. "We go in now," Colt said, and his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. That specific quiet that was not calm, but was the thing a man builds over calm, when calm is the only alternative to something worse. "Together. You stay behind me until—" "No," she said softly. He turned to look at her. "We go in together," she said, "side by side. If I'm behind you, I'm your weakness. If I'm beside you, I'm your partner." She held his gaze in the dark. "Let me be your partner." The silence between them had weight. His hand found hers in the dark and gripped it once hard, brief, unambiguous, and then let go. "Side by side," he said. Harlan moved to the door first. 3 seconds of listening. Then he nodded. Colt kicked it open. What happened in the next 30 seconds was not elegant. Whitmore's man went for his gun, and Harlan shot it out of his hand before the barrel had cleared the holster literally out of his hand, the gun clattering across the floor while the man grabbed his wrist and made a sound that was more shock than pain. Harlan crossed the room and had the man on the floor before the echo of the shot finished bouncing. Whitmore stood at the table with his hands flat on the stack of ledgers and his face for the first time in Eleanor's experience of him showing something genuine. Not fear exactly. Something colder. The look of a man who has gambled large and watched the dice come up wrong and is doing the rapid internal calculation of what, if anything, he still holds. He looked at Eleanor, then at Colt, back to Eleanor. "You have no authority here," he said. "Federal warrant signed in Helena," Harlan said from the floor where he was efficiently and professionally restraining his charge. "Marshal rides out this morning. You've got maybe 4 hours before he arrives, and I am a former United States Marshal, which gives me more authority in this room than you currently have." Whitmore's eyes moved to the ledgers beneath his hands. "Don't," Colt said. "Just that. One word." His voice was the flattest Eleanor had ever heard it. Whitmore looked at him, and something passed between them. Something old from before any of this, from the particular history that Whitmore had just confessed to, without knowing there were witnesses. The air between the two men had the quality of something long overdue. "You said it wouldn't be the first time," Colt said. Quiet. Steady. "Clara." Whitmore said nothing. "Say it," Colt said. "You're already finished. The ledgers are going with the marshal. The testimony is already filed in 2 cities. Your lawyers are going to find out what your man said in Bridger's Crossing this morning, and they are going to protect themselves." He took one step forward. "You have nothing left to trade and nothing left to protect. So say it." The silence stretched. And then Harold Whitmore, who had been a careful man for 30 years, looked at Colt Mercer with something that was almost contempt and said, "She found the land documents. Your wife. She found the deed transfers, and she understood what they meant, and she was going to take them to the county seat." A pause. "I couldn't let her do that." The room held its breath. It wasn't intended to." Whitmore stopped. Started again with the particular ugly syntax of a man trying to reframe something unfaceable. "The man I sent wasn't supposed to—" "Stop," Eleanor said. Her voice cut through the room like cold water. Everyone went still. She was looking at Whitmore with an expression that was not rage and not grief. It was something more controlled and in some ways more terrible than either. "You are going to step away from those ledgers," she said. "You are going to sit down. You are going to say nothing else until the marshal arrives. And whatever it is you think you were about to say to qualify what happened to Clara Mercer, you are going to leave it unsaid, because there is not a version of that sentence that makes it better. There is only a version that makes you look like a coward, and you have already managed that without the sentence." She held his gaze. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore." He sat down. She stepped forward and picked up the ledgers from the table. All of them. She held them against her chest, the same way she'd held her bag, the same practical grip, the same unsentimental assessment of what needed protecting. She turned to Colt. His face was terrible to look at, and she looked at it anyway, because looking away felt like an abandonment he didn't deserve. 10 years. 10 years of grief for a woman he'd loved and lost, and built a mountain life to survive. And now he knew what he'd only suspected. And the knowing was worse in some ways, and better in others, and entirely complicated in the ways that real things always were. She crossed to him. She stood close. "I've got the ledgers," she said quietly. "I've got everything. You don't have to hold anything else right now." He looked at her. His jaw moved once. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said rough and low, "How are you this—" "Don't," she said gently, an echo of her own word back to him. "Later. We'll have time for later." She held his gaze. "Right now I need you here." He exhaled slowly, steadied, came back into his own eyes in a way that was almost physical to witness. "I'm here," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been here the whole time." Outside, Mrs. Hatch's voice carried sharp and clear over the morning air. "I see a rider coming up from the south. He's got a badge." Harlan looked up from the floor with the expression of a man whose timing had worked out. "Marshall's early," he said, sounding gratified. Eleanor adjusted the ledgers in her arms and looked at Harold Whitmore, sitting in his chair. And she thought about the auction block and the cold church and the choice she'd made to walk out that door with a stranger who turned out to be exactly what he said he was. She thought about 14 pages in a bag, about a gun her father gave her when she was 18, about the particular grace of being seen clearly by someone who doesn't flinch at what they see. She thought about all of it, and she felt the solid weight of those ledgers in her hands, and she waited for the marshal to come through the door. It was almost over. Not quite, but almost, and Eleanor Vale was still standing. Marshal Thomas Greer was not a large man, but he had the kind of stillness that made rooms feel smaller when he entered them. He came through the door of the relay station, with his badge visible and his gun holstered, and his eyes taking inventory of everything in the room in approximately 4 seconds. Whitmore in the chair, Harlan's man on the floor, Colt standing with his arms at his sides, and Eleanor holding a stack of ledgers against her chest, like she'd carried them up a mountain, specifically to hand them to a federal officer, which in every way that mattered, she had. Greer looked at Harlan. "Voss." "Greer." Harlan stood up from the floor and brushed his knees. "You made good time." "Rode through the night." He looked at Eleanor. "You're the Vale woman." "Eleanor Vale," she said. "I have testimony on file with Frank Aldridge and Bridger's Crossing, a copy staged for your office in Helena, and these." She held out the ledgers. Harold Whitmore's personal accounts and loan records. He removed them from the bank last night in an attempt to destroy the paper trail. "I took them from the table approximately 20 minutes ago." Greer took the ledgers. He opened the top one, looked at the first 2 pages with the practiced scan of a man who knew what he was looking for, then closed it. He looked at Whitmore. Whitmore said nothing. His lawyer's instincts had finally arrived 4 days too late to do him any real good, and he had settled into a silence that was the last dignity available to him. "Harold Whitmore," Greer said. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of land fraud, debt manipulation, coercion, and depending on what the prosecutor decides to do with what I'm hearing about a woman named Clara Mercer, potentially a great deal more." He reached into his coat and produced the warrant with the unhurried precision of a man who had done this before and felt no need to make theater of it. "Stand up." Whitmore stood. He looked for the first time genuinely old, and then he did something no one in the room expected. He looked at Eleanor, not at Greer, not at Colt, not at Harlan, at Eleanor. And he said with a flatness that might have been intended as dignity, and landed closer to exposure, "Your father came to me, every time. I never came to him." "I know," she said. He blinked. That apparently was not the response he'd expected. "I know he did," she said. "I know he had a sickness and it cost him everything, and it cost me everything too. That's in my records as well. All of it." She held his gaze with no anger in it, something colder and cleaner than anger, the kind of clarity you earn on the other side of a very long grief. "That doesn't make what you did to him reasonable. You knew he was sick, and you used it. You kept lending to a drowning man because you wanted to own what the drowning left behind." She paused. "I don't hate you, Mr. Whitmore. I've spent 2 years trying to hate you, and it never quite took. But I will testify against you with every word I have, and I will mean every word." Marshal Greer looked at her with an expression of pure professional respect. Then he put his hand on Whitmore's arm and walked him out the door. The room exhaled. Mrs. Hatch came in from outside, slightly windblown, and surveyed the aftermath with the evaluating eye of a woman who had seen the inside of too many difficult rooms and stopped being rattled by them. "Well," she said, "that's done then." "That part is," Harlan said. He looked at Colt. Colt was standing by the far wall. He hadn't moved since Greer walked Whitmore out. His arms were at his sides, and his face was turned slightly away, and Eleanor understood without being told that he was dealing privately with something that had just become real in a way it hadn't been before. The confirmation. The words spoken aloud in a room with witnesses. Clara found the land documents. I couldn't let her do that. 10 years of knowing without knowing. And now just knowing. She walked to him. She didn't say anything. She stood beside him and was quiet, which was a thing she had learned somewhere in the last 4 days was sometimes worth more than words. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said rough and low, "She would have liked you." Eleanor felt that land in her chest. She let it sit there. "Tell me about her." He turned to look at her slightly surprised, the same surprise he kept showing whenever she did something he hadn't anticipated, which was frequently. "Not now if you don't want to," she said quickly. "But sometime. I'd like to know who she was." He looked at her for a long moment. "She was funny," he said finally. Not in an obvious way. Quiet funny, the kind where you'd be doing something ordinary and she'd say one thing and you'd laugh for an hour. Something in his face shifted, not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something that had lived alongside grief for so long that it had taken on the same shape. "She was the bravest person I knew. Before." A pause. "Before you." Eleanor held completely still. "That's not—" He stopped, ran a hand over his face. "I'm not saying it right." "You're saying it fine," she said quietly. "Eleanor." He turned to face her fully, and his expression was the most unguarded she'd ever seen. It all the careful control set aside, just the man underneath it. "I have been alone for 10 years, and I convinced myself that was a choice instead of a hiding. And then you walked out of that church with your bag and your spine and your 14 pages of the truth, and you made it very difficult to keep pretending that the hiding was acceptable." He stopped. "I don't know how to—" Another stop. He exhaled. "I haven't said any of this to another person since Clara." "I know," she said. "I can tell." "Does that—" He searched her face. "Does that matter to you? The length of it? That it's been this long and I'm—" "Colt," she said. "The length of it is part of what I trust about it." He stared at her. "A man who moves fast has reasons to move fast," she said. "A man who took 10 years has reasons of a different kind." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not frightened by the length of it. I'm—" She paused, and for the first time in the conversation, allowed herself to be slightly less composed. "I am standing in a relay station at the top of a Montana mountain pass with ink on my hands from 14 pages of testimony and a gun in my bag and 3 days of hard travel behind me, and I am not frightened by any of it, including you." A beat. "That should probably tell you something." He took one step toward her. She didn't step back. He raised his hand and touched her face with the same careful deliberateness she remembered from the church, those rough, careful hands that held things like they were worth holding, and she felt the warmth of it go all the way through her. "Eleanor Vale," he said. "Colt Mercer," she said back. He kissed her. Not the way he had in the church, not the weight of a claim or the strategy of a rescue. This was something else entirely. This was two people who had come a long way through difficult country and arrived somewhere real and knew it, and were choosing it with full knowledge of everything the choosing meant. She kissed him back with the same completeness, both hands finding the front of his coat, and it lasted longer than either of them probably intended, and when they separated, the room was very quiet. From the doorway, Harlan's voice. "I'm going outside. Mrs. Hatch, come with me." "I am already outside," said Mrs. Hatch from outside. "Good," said Harlan, and pulled the door closed behind him. The trial took 4 months. Eleanor testified on 3 separate days, and each time she was composed and precise and relentlessly specific. And Whitmore's lawyers, there were 3 of them as predicted, found the 14 pages and the ledgers and the depositions from Cole and Mrs. Hatch and young Jeb Purvis, who had turned evidence in exchange for leniency and turned out to have quite a lot of it insurmountable and professionally humiliating. They tried twice to shake Eleanor's account, and failed both times because you cannot shake a record that was written down at the time of the events with dates and signatures and the particular clarity of a woman who knew even in her grief that truth needed to be preserved against the possibility that it would one day matter. Harold Whitmore was convicted on 7 counts. The sentence was substantial. His properties were seized. The debts he had manufactured against Caldwell Creek's families, all of them not just Eleanor's father's, were vacated by court order, which caused Reverend Aldous to weep openly in the public gallery and caused Eleanor to feel something complicated, that she eventually identified as the particular mix of vindication and exhaustion that comes from a fight that was worth having and is now over. She was sitting on the courthouse steps when the verdict came out, her hands folded in her lap, her face in the afternoon sun. Colt sat beside her. He had been beside her for 4 months in every sense of the word, steady and present, and consistently stubbornly there, the way he was there about everything, not loudly, not with demonstration, but completely. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. She leaned back and looked at the sky. "I keep waiting to feel different. More finished or more I don't know. Resolved." "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. Tired, grateful, a little lighter. She glanced at him. "You—" He was quiet for a moment. "Like something that needed to close has closed, and something that needed to open." He stopped. The corner of his mouth moved. "Is open." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that steady, clear gaze that she had stopped finding unnerving approximately 3 days into their acquaintance, and had since come to find the most reliable thing she knew. "I want to go home," she said. He knew what she meant. She saw it in his face, not surprise this time, just recognition. "The cabin," he said. "The cabin," she confirmed. "If that's still." "It was always still," he said. "Quiet. Absolute." She reached over and put her hand on his, and he turned his palm up and held it, the simple fact of 2 people who had decided and were not deciding again. Day. Harlan came to find them an hour later, in the good mood of a man whose work had resolved cleanly. He sat down on the step below them, stretched his knees out with the grunt of a man making his body's displeasure known, and looked at the street with the satisfaction of someone reviewing a completed project. "I've been asked," he said to no one in particular, "whether I'd consider coming back on in a consulting capacity for the marshal's office. The Whitmore case apparently raised my profile. And," Colt said, "I told them I'd think about it." He paused. "I told them I had prior obligations." "You don't have any obligations," Colt said. "I'm making some." He looked back over his shoulder at them both. "You 2 are going to need a neighbor. The high country gets long in winter. I know a claim about 4 miles west of your ridge that's been sitting empty." He said it with the elaborate casualness of a man who had thought about it considerably more than he was letting on. "I'm not young enough to be useful in emergencies anymore, but I'm old enough to be useful in the specific way of a person who has seen most things and can occasionally say the right word at the right time." Eleanor looked at him. She felt something warm and full move through her. "Harlan." "Don't make it sentimental," he said. "I just want somewhere to put my horse." "The claim is yours," Colt said. "If you want it." "I want it." Harlan looked forward again. "Good." A pause. "Mrs. Hatch is also moving incidentally. She has a niece in Bridger's Crossing, and she says Caldwell Creek stopped feeling like home about the same time it started being Whitmore's. She told me to tell you both, and I am quoting directly, that she expects regular correspondence and will not be accepting excuses." Eleanor laughed. It came out full and easy, the kind of laugh that takes no effort, the kind that lives in a person's chest and comes out when the circumstances finally permit it. Colt turned to look at her with the expression of a man who has heard something he wants to hear again often for a long time. "Tell her she'll have it," Eleanor said. "Every week." Harlan nodded satisfied and returned to looking at the street. They rode back to the mountains 2 days later in the early morning, the air cold and clean and sharp as the first breath after a long-held exhale. The country opened up around them as they climbed wider, quieter, that vast Montana sky, filling the space above the tree line with the particular blue that existed at altitude and nowhere else. Eleanor had sold nothing. The house in Caldwell Creek had been returned to her by court order, cleared of all debt, and she had walked through its rooms one last time with the deliberateness of a person saying a proper goodbye, and then she had locked the door and ridden away from it without looking back. There was nothing there she needed. Everything she needed was ahead. The cabin came into view through the trees, and she felt it the same way she'd felt it the first time, that recognition of something deliberate, something thought about. But it was different now. The first time she'd seen it as shelter. Now she saw it as what it was. Home. Colt dismounted and moved to help her down, and she let him, not because she couldn't manage it herself, but because she understood now the difference between needing help and choosing to accept it from someone whose hands she trusted. His hands at her waist were steady and warm, and she stood in them for a moment before stepping back, and he looked at her with everything he didn't say on his face, which was considerable. "I want to build something," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "An addition. On the east side. I need space for a desk and enough light for writing." She looked at the cabin. "I've been corresponding with Aldridge. He wants a series of pieces about the trial, about Whitmore, about what happened to the families in Caldwell Creek. He thinks there's a readership for it." She looked at Colt. "I think he's right." He was looking at her with that expression again, the one that was adjacent to startled and adjacent to moved, and was entirely its own specific thing that she had come to understand was what it looked like when Colt Mercer was happy. "A desk," he said. "And shelves," she said. "I have books in storage in Caldwell Creek. I'll send for them. Shelves I can do." He looked at the east wall of the cabin with the evaluating eye of a man doing practical calculations. "The light is good on that side in the morning." "That's when I write best," she said. He looked back at her. "I know." A pause, slightly rough with the admission. "I watched you at Aldridge's, the way you worked. You go still, and then the pen moves fast and you don't stop." He stopped, looked slightly embarrassed by the detail of his own observation. She felt warmth move through her chest, at being watched and noticed, and known in the ordinary way, the daily way, the way that accumulates over time into something permanent. "You were supposed to be watching the street," she said. "I was doing both." She stepped toward him and took his face in her hands, the way he had taken hers in the church 4 months ago. That same deliberate, careful hold, and she kissed him once, brief and certain, and when she stepped back, he was looking at her with every wall down. "I love you," she said, plainly, directly, without preamble or qualification, because she was Eleanor Vale, and she had learned the hard way that the things worth saying were worth saying clearly, and the time to say them was when you meant them. "I want that said between us, on record, clearly." He was very still for a moment. The stillness of a man receiving something he had been a long time without and recognizing it fully. "Eleanor," he said. "You don't have to say it back right now," she said. "I know you mean it. I can see you mean it. I just needed it said." "Eleanor," he said again, and this time it wasn't the beginning of a sentence. It was the whole sentence, the whole declaration. He said her name the way you say the name of something you are not taking for granted. He took her hands from his face and held them in both of his. "I love you. Clearly and on the record, and I have known it longer than I've said it." He tightened his hands around hers. "I'm done being quiet about the things that matter." She held his gaze. Something settled in her, final and full and clean. The particular settling of a person who has carried something heavy for a long time and set it down in exactly the right place. Behind them, from approximately 4 miles to the west, where he had absolutely no business being, yet came the faint and entirely unsurprising sound of Harlan Voss talking to his horse in the tones of a man narrating his own journey and finding it satisfactory. Eleanor laughed. Colt laughed. They laughed together at the top of a Montana mountain in the cold, clear morning air, which was undignified and real and exactly right. Spring came to the high country the way it always did, slowly. Then, all at once, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes, and the aspens coming back, and the air losing its killing edge 1 degree at a time. The addition went up on the east wall by late March, built by Colt's hands and Eleanor's directions, and Harlan's periodic unsolicited commentary from a respectful distance that was never quite as respectful as he implied. Eleanor's desk sat beneath the window, where the morning light came in full and clean, and the shelves went up beside it, and the books came from Caldwell Creek in a wagon driven by Mrs. Hatch, who stayed for 2 weeks and reorganized everyone's kitchen without being asked, and left with the satisfied air of a woman whose work was done. The articles ran in Aldridge's paper, and then in 2 papers in Helena, and then in a paper in Kansas City, because the story of a woman who kept 14 pages of truth in a bag and carried them across a mountain had apparently found its readership as Aldridge had predicted. The letters came in after. Dozens of them. Women mostly, but not only. People who had their own 14 pages, their own quiet records of wrong things done by powerful men, in the assumption that no one was keeping count. Eleanor answered every letter. At her desk. In the morning light. Colt brought her coffee without being asked, and she took it without looking up from her writing, and he watched her work with the unguarded expression of a man who had found the specific thing he hadn't known he needed, and was not confused about it anymore. One morning in April, she looked up from a letter and found him in the doorway with his coffee and his expression, and 10 years of solitude entirely permanently behind him, and she said, "You should write something too. What you know about this land the way you know it, nobody else knows it the way you do." He looked at her. "I'm not a writer." "You talk well enough," she said. Same principle. He thought about it. He looked out the window at the mountains he had lived in for a decade and learned in the way you learn a thing you've given yourself over to entirely. "Maybe," he said. "The shelf has room," she said, and turned back to her letter. He stood in the doorway and looked at her writing, and at the shelf, and at the life they had built in this cabin at the top of a Montana ridge, specific and deliberate and entirely theirs. And he knew with the clarity of a man who has been honest with himself long enough to recognize the truth when it arrives and stay with it, that this was not what he had expected when he'd come down the mountain. It was better. It was real and warm and daily and full of a woman who kept records and asked good questions and carried a gun her father gave her and loved him plainly and on the record. It was better than anything he had known to want. The Montana sky opened wide above the cabin, above the ridge, above everything they had built and were still building, and Colt Mercer stepped inside, closed the door on the cold, and came home.